The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the desert sky in streaks of amber and crimson when Apacha spotted her. She lay motionless at the edge of a narrow ravine, half hidden among the jagged rocks and scrubby brush. At first, he thought she might have been another casualty of the harsh land, one of the many travelers or wanderers who succumbed to thirst, heat, or misfortune. But as he drew closer, the faint sound of her shallow breaths reached his ears, and his keen eyes noticed the blood matted into her dark hair, a streak down her temple. She was alive, but barely. Apache's instincts sharpened. He crouched low behind a boulder and surveyed the area. The footprints around her told a story. There had been a struggle. Perhaps a band of raiders or rival Apache scouts, he couldn't be sure yet. What he did know was that if she remained where she was, she would die before the night fell. The desert was unforgiving, and predators of every kind would take advantage of her helplessness. Without hesitation, he stepped out from his cover. "Stay still," he said softly, though he doubted she could even hear him. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with pain and fear. For a moment, she tried to rise, only to collapse back onto the dirt. Apache's hand was already beneath her shoulders, steadying her. He could feel the tension in her body, the fear that screamed through her every movement. "You're safe now," he murmured, though even he didn't fully believe it yet. The trek ahead would be grueling. The nearest water source was miles away, and the terrain was jagged and unforgiving. Carrying her would not be easy. He had faced harsh deserts and long hunts, but never a burden so fragile and so desperately alive. As he lifted her into his arms, she winced, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice hoarse, nearly lost in the wind. Apache glanced down at her. The intensity of her gaze, despite the pain, was startling. There was something fierce in her spirit, a flame that refused to be extinguished even in her weakened state. He respected that. More than that, he felt a rising determination to see her through this ordeal alive. Step by painstaking step, he began his journey through the rocky terrain. Each movement sent jolts of pain through her broken limbs, and each groan of discomfort tugged at his heart. Apache gritted his teeth. He had carried game heavier than this, battled storms and treacherous cliffs. But never had he carried a life, so delicate and yet so stubbornly unwilling to surrender. Shadows stretched long across the desert as the sun sank lower, casting a red glow over the rocks. The temperature was dropping, and Apache knew the night would bring its own dangers, predators, bandits, or simply the biting cold. Yet he pressed on, step after step, silent except for the careful placement of his feet and the occasional murmur of reassurance. Every so often, she would murmur something, half coherent, half pleading, and he would answer softly, "Almost there. Keep still. Don't fight it." There was no time for conversation, no luxury for sentiment, but even in the silence, a connection formed. He could feel her trust settling over him, fragile as it was. Like the first fragile buds of a desert flower in bloom. By the time darkness began to settle over the canyon, Apache had carried her for what felt like hours. His muscles screaming, his body pushed to the brink. Yet he did not stop. She was alive because of him, and nothing in the desert, nothing in the world, would convince him to leave her behind. For the first time in a long while, Apache's solitary existence felt heavier, not with burden, but with purpose. Tonight the desert would test him as it never had before. But he would not fail. The first light of evening cast long shadows over the jagged desert terrain as Apache adjusted the weight of the wounded woman in his arms. Her body was slight but surprisingly tense, as if every muscle fought against surrender, and he realized she was trying to maintain some dignity despite the injury. He could feel the heat radiating from her fevered skin, and he knew the hours ahead would test both their endurance. The desert, which had seemed almost tranquil from a distance, now revealed its unforgiving nature: rocky outcrops, narrow ledges, and thorny bushes that snagged at his clothes and scratched her skin. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice low and steady. She made a faint sound of acknowledgment, eyes half closed in exhaustion. Apacha studied her features more closely now: high cheekbones, dark hair matted with blood, and a subtle defiance in the curve of her lips. Something about her reminded him of the stories his elders had told him of the Apache women of old: fierce, resilient, unyielding. He had faced many challenges in the wilderness, but carrying someone who refused to break under the weight of injury was a new trial entirely. Each step was a negotiation with the landscape. Loose rock shifted beneath his boots, sand crumbled underfoot, and the occasional hidden crevice threatened to trip him. Yet he pressed forward, instinct guiding him as much as determination. His mind ran through the routes he knew, the hidden trails, the shallow riverbeds that offered easier footing, the outcrops where he could rest without fear of predators. Every decision mattered. One wrong step could send them both tumbling down into the unforgiving canyon below. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature began to drop, bringing a sharp chill that crept under their clothes. He tightened his grip around her, instinctively shielding her from the wind. The woman shivered, and Apacha felt a flicker of empathy pierce through his focus on survival. "Almost there," he said, though he had no idea how far there really was. The nearest village or water source was still miles away, and each step seemed to stretch the distance further. She stirred slightly, murmuring something he couldn't quite hear. I can walk," she whispered, her voice strained and brittle. Apacha shook his head. "Not yet. You'll fall. Stay with me." There was no room for argument. He had learned long ago that pride could be deadly in the wilderness. Yet he sensed her frustration, the same frustration he had once felt during countless trials that tested his endurance and patience. As darkness crept over the desert, the first sounds of nocturnal life began to emerge: the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. Apache's senses sharpened. Every movement of his feet, every whisper of the wind became a signal to watch, listen, and anticipate danger. Though the woman was injured, he sensed her awareness too. She occasionally shifted her gaze toward the horizon, alert, assessing, silently learning. Despite the strain, a subtle bond began to form between them. It wasn't spoken. There was no time for words, beyond simple commands and reassurances, but it was tangible in the way she leaned slightly against him when a sudden shift of terrain threatened to unbalance him, in the way he instinctively adjusted his pace to match her breathing. Mutual trust, fragile and quiet, was being forged step by step, mile by mile. By the time they reached a narrow plateau overlooking a dry arroyo, night had fully settled. Stars pricked the sky like shards of silver, and the desert seemed both beautiful and threatening in the darkness. Apacha lowered the woman gently to the ground, careful not to jar her wounds. "We rest here," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes reflecting fatigue and something else, something he couldn't yet name. Gratitude, yes, but perhaps also recognition that survival depended on him now. Entirely. As he gathered some rocks to build a small shelter against the wind. Apacha allowed himself a brief thought. This journey was just beginning, and already the desert demanded more than he had anticipated. Yet he would not falter. She was alive because of him, and he would carry her through the night, through whatever trials awaited, no matter the cost. The desert night descended quickly, swallowing the last of the twilight in an inky blackness that pressed against Apache's senses. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind cut through his clothes like a blade, carrying with it the dry scent of sand and distant sagebrush. He tightened his hold on the woman, pulling her closer to shield her from the chill. Every muscle in his body ached from hours of carrying her, but there was no room for hesitation. In the wilderness, even a moment's lapse could mean death. As they moved carefully along a narrow ridge, Apacha sensed the first sign of danger. Footsteps, not his own, echoed faintly against the rocks, irregular but deliberate. He froze, holding his breath, and pressed the woman gently against his chest. Her eyes, wide with fear, met his. He could see her pulse thumping in the side of her neck, hear the shallow, uneven rhythm of her breathing. She wanted to ask him what was happening, but the tension in his jaw and the sharp tilt of his head told her to stay silent. From the darkness emerged shapes, figures moving cautiously along the trail below. Raiders, or perhaps bounty hunters. He couldn't tell yet, and it didn't matter. Apache's mind raced, calculating the risks, evaluating the terrain, and silently plotting a route that would give them cover and an advantage. Every step could be fatal, but the woman's life depended on his skill and instinct. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. She clutched his arm weakly, trusting him without question. Together, they descended into a small hollow hidden by boulders and brush. He crouched, holding her low as the figures passed on the path above. The faint glint of moonlight on metal caught his eye guns, knives, weapons that could end both of their lives in a heartbeat. Apache waited until the raiders had moved out of sight before rising. Every step required careful balance. He adjusted his stance to avoid slipping, to prevent his burden from toppling him. The woman murmured something in pain, and he paused, gently adjusting her position. "I've got you," he said, the words firm and unwavering. "We keep going, but slowly. You can rest against me when you need." The journey through the canyon became treacherous. Loose stones shifted underfoot, threatening to send them plunging into the darkness below. Thorny bush snagged at their clothing and tore at the woman's skin. Apache's muscles burned with fatigue, yet he pressed on, drawing strength from an unspoken promise. He would not let anything happen to her. "Not now, not ever." At one point, the woman whispered, almost inaudibly, "Why? Help me?" Her voice was a mixture of pain and disbelief, as though the world had hardened her to expect nothing but indifference. Apache didn't answer immediately. There was no simple reply that could explain why he carried her, why he risked his own life without thought. Finally, he said, "Because I can, and because you deserve to live." His words were blunt, but in the quiet desert night, they carried a weight neither of them had anticipated. Hours passed, the darkness stretching endlessly around them. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, yet they were the only witnesses to their struggle. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a small animal, sent Apache's senses into high alert. He moved like a shadow, silent, precise, aware of every detail. The woman's trust in him deepened with each careful step. She realized that her survival depended entirely on this man who refused to let her go, even in the most perilous conditions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small plateau where the wind was less biting and the terrain more forgiving. Apache lowered her gently to the ground, letting her lean against a boulder for support. Both were exhausted, their bodies screaming for rest, but the immediate danger had passed for now. Yet the night was far from over, and Apache knew that the desert had more trials in store. As he looked down at her pale, bruised face illuminated by the faint glow of the stars, he silently vowed, no matter what came next, he would carry her through it. And somehow she would survive. The small plateau offered a brief respite, though it was hardly comfort. Apacha had arranged a few rocks to create a crude shelter against the wind, and he gathered some dry brush for a tiny fire. Sparks danced into the night sky as he struck flint against stone, the soft crackle of flames breaking the eerie silence that had followed them for hours. The woman leaned against the boulder, her body trembling not entirely from the cold, but from the exhaustion and trauma that clung to her like a second skin. For a long moment, they sat in silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional snap of the fire. Apacha studied her in the dim glow. Her eyes, once sharp with defiance, were now softened by fatigue. Her lips twitched as if she were about to speak, then closed again. There was a fragility in her posture that hadn't been there before, a quiet admission of need. Apacha felt a rare pang of empathy. He had spent much of his life in solitude, relying on his own strength and instinct. Yet here was a life entirely in his care, fragile and human. "I didn't expect anyone to come," she whispered at last, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. She glanced at him, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. "Especially not for me." Apache's gaze softened. "Sometimes the world surprises us," he said. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. She was wounded, yes, but she was also proud, stubborn, and fiercely alive. That spirit was part of why he had risked himself to carry her across miles of desert. For a few moments, the only sound was the wind threading through the rocks, the firelight flickering over their faces. Then she began to speak, slowly at first, as if testing the waters of trust. She told him about her family, about a life once filled with laughter and safety before it had been torn away by violence and betrayal. The words tumbled out in fragments, memories of a brother she had lost, of a home burned to the ground, of nights spent hiding in the shadows. Apacha listened, silent, allowing her to reveal what she would, offering no judgment, only the steady presence of someone who would not abandon her. In turn, Apacha found himself speaking, though cautiously. He told her of the desert, of the lessons learned through years of wandering its harsh expanse, of moments when survival had meant choosing between his own safety and that of others. He spoke not to impress, but to connect, revealing slivers of a life usually hidden behind stoicism and solitude. In the firelight, their shared vulnerability created a fragile bond. One neither had anticipated. She shivered, and he instinctively shifted to drape a blanket over her shoulders, brushing a strand of hair from her face. There was a quiet intimacy in the gesture, simple yet profound. Neither spoke of it, yet the unspoken message was clear. In this moment, they were not simply rescuer and rescued, they were human beings, bound together by circumstance and growing trust. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the rocky walls of the plateau. Apacha could feel her tension slowly easing, the muscles in her body relaxing as the weight of fear began to lift, if only slightly. And yet, he sensed the lingering trauma, the quiet edge of weariness that would take longer to heal. He did not rush her. He had learned that trust, like survival in the desert, required patience, vigilance, and respect. Finally, she closed her eyes, leaning into him slightly, not surrendering, but accepting the momentary refuge he offered. Apacha watched her, his own heart heavier than he expected. He had carried her through the physical dangers of the desert. But this connection, this opening of the soul felt even more fragile, and yet infinitely more rewarding. Tonight, they were more than survivor and guardian. They were two people who had begun to understand one another, who had shared fear, pain, and memory under the indifferent stars. And for Apacha, that understanding would prove as vital as any weapon when the challenges of the desert returned at dawn. Dawn arrived with a pale, tentative light spilling across the desert like a hesitant promise. Apacha had kept watch through the night, listening to the whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of desert creatures. The woman had slept fitfully against him, her body tense even in exhaustion, as if the fear that had haunted her for days would not release its grip. Now, with the sun rising, the journey resumed, and the full weight of the desert's challenge became evident. Apacha hoisted her once more into his arms. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her wounded body and left his own muscles burning with fatigue. Yet he pressed onward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could mean death. The desert floor was unrelenting rock-strewn paths, narrow ridges, and hidden gullies that threatened to twist an ankle or send them tumbling down jagged cliffs. Every step was a test of endurance, every breath a reminder of how delicate life could be. I can walk," she murmured again, her voice weak but insistent. She tried to push herself upright, to ease some of the burden from him. Apache shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not yet. You'll fall. I've carried you this far. Trust me a little longer." His tone left no room for argument, but there was care woven into it, a recognition of her courage and determination. For hours they moved through the harsh terrain. Apache felt the strain in his shoulders, the burning ache in his legs, and the growing sweat that soaked through his shirt. He was strong, trained for survival, but carrying another human being over this distance was unlike any battle he had faced. He glanced down occasionally at her face, and each time he saw both pain and resilience mirrored there. She was fighting silently, refusing to surrender even as her body begged for rest. That defiance inspired him, and yet he could not ignore the burden it weighed on him in ways both physical and emotional. By midday, the sun had climbed high, beating down mercilessly on the canyon walls and sending heat waves rippling across the sand. The woman's breathing had grown shallow, and her attempts to help seemed weaker with each passing moment. Apache paused briefly in a shaded nook, setting her down carefully against a boulder. He wiped the sweat from his brow, taking a deep breath, and forced himself to relax for a heartbeat. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But even the strong need help." She looked at him then, her eyes dark pools of fatigue and something else, gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of their growing connection. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were simple, yet in the silence of the desert they carried weight. Apache nodded, offering no reply beyond the steady presence of his hand on her shoulder. They pressed on, each mile a negotiation with the desert and with their own limitations. Apache allowed her to lean lightly against him now, to share some of the effort, even if just a little. Together they found a rhythm, a subtle give and take that allowed them to endure the grueling journey. The physical strain forced emotional revelations, stories of loss, brief confessions of fear, and shared moments of quiet humor when the heat or terrain caused minor slips or stumbles. By late afternoon, their progress was painfully slow. The woman's legs shook from the strain, and Apache's arms trembled with exhaustion. Yet they had moved farther than either had thought possible. The desert, vast and indifferent, had tested their bodies and their wills, but it had also forged a bond and understanding that they could rely on each other not just for survival, but for support, for presence, for humanity. As they paused again to rest in the shade of a twisted, gnarled tree, Apache looked at her and thought, if the desert can demand this much from us, then perhaps we are stronger than even the desert knows. The journey ahead would be no less challenging, but together. They had discovered a resilience that neither had anticipated, and that resilience would be tested in ways far beyond the physical. The desert's late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows across the uneven terrain, the golden light blinding in patches and fading into deep, stark contrasts elsewhere. Apache's steps had grown careful, deliberate. Every crackle of stone beneath his boots, every faint brush against a thorny bush was magnified in his senses. He had carried the woman for hours, and though fatigue pressed down on him like a weight, something else prickled at the back of his mind. They were not alone. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Disturbed sand in the corners of a dry riverbed, Footprints that didn't match the local wildlife, the faint echo of voices carried by the wind. Apacha froze, lowering the woman gently to the ground behind a boulder. Her eyes were wide with exhaustion, but when she saw the tension in his stance, she understood immediately. Danger was near. "They're close," he said quietly, barely moving his lips. She nodded, fear threading through her fatigue, but she stayed still, trusting him as she always had, even in pain. Apache scanned the ridges and gullies, tracing the paths that the intruders might take. Raiders, bounty hunters, perhaps rival Apache scouts, he did not know. But he did know that if they were caught unprepared, the desert could easily claim both their lives. He shifted the woman so that she crouched low, her head resting against his chest. "If they see you, they might attack immediately," he whispered. "We'll have to move quietly. Wait for my signal." She nodded again, small movements of trust and compliance. Apache's heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the fierce protective instinct that had carried him across the desert for so long. From the shadows, faint shapes began to emerge along a distant ridge, silhouettes against the dying light. Apache's eyes narrowed. The pursuers were not moving recklessly. They were experienced, stalking like predators who knew their prey. He calculated silently, considering alternate routes through the rocky gullies and shallow washes, mentally mapping paths that would give them cover and leverage. Each step had to be precise, each pause deliberate. One misstep could mean disaster. "Stay close," he murmured, guiding her silently as they shifted along a narrow ledge. Her small, hesitant movements mirrored his own precision. She was tired beyond words, but even in weakness, there was courage, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. Apache found himself admiring her resolve. It made the danger more bearable, somehow, to face it alongside someone who refused to simply submit. They pressed on, using shadows and terrain to conceal themselves. The desert that had seemed merely harsh now felt alive with threat, every crevice a potential ambush, every ridge a vantage point for eyes that sought them. The sun slipped lower, bathing the rocks in red light, and Apache knew they would soon have to cross a narrow canyon, a choke point that could either hide them or expose them entirely. "Trust me," he said softly, noticing the tremor in her hands. She blinked, nodding, her faith unwavering despite the terror etched in her features. Apache drew in a deep breath, letting the desert silence fill his senses before taking the next careful step. Hours of travel had taught him the value of patience. He waited for the right moment, timing their movements with the subtle shifts in the pursuer's pattern. Each decision carried weight, but for the first time, Apache realized that the woman's survival depended not just on his strength, but on their mutual awareness and teamwork. She was no longer merely a burden to carry, she was an ally in strategy, a partner in endurance dot by the time night threatened to overtake them. They had gained some distance from the shadows of pursuit. Apache lowered the woman to a patch of flat rock, the first moment they could rest since dawn. Their bodies ached, their muscles burned, but the tension had eased slightly. They were not safe yet, but they had survived another gauntlet. He looked down at her, sweat and dust clinging to their skin, then silently acknowledged a truth neither had voiced aloud. The desert had tested their physical limits, but now it had begun to test their trust, their patience, and their courage. And together they had passed. The moon rose high over the desert, casting a silver glow that turned jagged rocks and twisted trees into ghostly silhouettes. Apache had led the woman along a narrow canyon that twisted like a snake through the rocky landscape. Each step was careful, deliberate, and exhausting. The earlier pursuit had forced them to move silently. And now, though the immediate threat had faded, the terrain itself presented a new danger. Ahead lay a narrow ledge carved along the edge of a steep drop, the only path to a hidden stream that promised water and temporary safety. A misstep here would mean death, a plunge into jagged rocks far below. Apacha stopped, lowering the woman to the ground. "We have to cross carefully," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of authority tempered by concern. She nodded, her face pale but determined, and he could feel her pulse quickening with fear. "This is steep," she whispered, her voice trembling. Apacha gave her a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not impossible, but you must trust me completely. One wrong move, and we both die." His tone was matter-of-fact, but beneath it was a silent promise. He would not let her fall. He moved first, testing each step, feeling the precarious grip of stone beneath his boots. Then he extended a hand to her. "Hold on tightly," he instructed. She hesitated, fear flashing across her face, but she obeyed. Apache's grip was firm, unyielding, yet careful, guiding her body along the narrow path, ensuring her wounded leg didn't bear the weight it couldn't sustain. As they progressed, the wind whipped through the canyon, tugging at their clothing and threatening their balance. The woman's fingers trembled against his hand, but Apache maintained a calm steadiness, speaking in low tones to keep her focused. "One step at a time. Don't look down. Just follow me." His voice was a tether, anchoring her in the moment, anchoring her trust in him. Halfway across, a loose rock shifted beneath her foot. She gasped, and Apache's instincts flared. He tightened his hold instantly, preventing a fall that could have been fatal. "It's all right," he said, though his heart pounded. "I've got you. Keep going." The woman nodded, her fear tempered by the realization that he would not let her fall. She leaned slightly into him, allowing herself to rely fully on his strength. Her own defiance softened into trust. By the time they reached the other side, their bodies were tense, muscles screaming from the exertion. But their spirits had shifted. The crossing had been perilous, yet it had forged something more profound than mere survival, a shared understanding, a bond rooted in mutual reliance. For the first time, the woman realized that her life depended not just on Apache's strength, but on her willingness to trust completely. And for Apache, he recognized that this trust was no burden, it was a connection that strengthened him as much as it protected her. They paused by the stream. The sound of flowing water a soothing contrast to the tension that had gripped them for hours. Apache knelt beside her, letting her drink and cool herself. She looked at him, eyes bright and filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. I didn't think I could do it," she admitted softly. Apache shook his head. "You could. You just needed to let someone guide you." The night settled around them, quiet except for the gentle babble of the stream and the distant call of a coyote. They sat together, side by side, both exhausted, both changed. The test had been physical, yes, but it had also tested their patience, courage, and willingness to rely on each other completely. In the stillness of the desert, a fragile bond had been cemented, a trust that would carry them through the trials yet to come. As Apache looked up at the stars, he realized that the desert had already taken much from them, but it had given something too, a connection forged in danger, endurance, and quiet understanding. Tomorrow the journey would continue, but tonight they had survived not just the terrain, but the fear, and emerged stronger for it. The desert had grown quieter, almost eerily so, as the moon climbed higher into the night sky. Apache's muscles burned with fatigue, each step a negotiation between determination and exhaustion. The woman in his arms was equally spent, her head resting against his shoulder, her body limp from the strain of the journey. Yet they could see the distant glow of the settlement, perhaps a village or a hidden camp faint against the horizon. Safety was close, but the final miles stretched ahead like a cruel test of endurance. Every step forward was agony. Apache's legs ached, His arms trembled, and sweat stung his eyes, but he refused to rest for long. The woman murmured occasionally, tiny sounds of discomfort or encouragement, and he found himself speaking softly to her in turn. "Almost there. Keep holding on. We're nearly safe." His voice was low, steady, a constant amidst the physical torment and the relentless desert night. The terrain grew rougher again as they approached a rocky plateau leading to the final ascent. Loose stones shifted beneath his boots, and jagged edges scraped at his clothing and her skin. Each careful step required focus, precision, and sheer willpower. Apacha felt the weight of her body not just physically but emotionally. He had carried her for hours through danger and exhaustion, and the thought of failing now was unbearable. She shifted slightly, wincing. I can help," she whispered, her voice weak but insistent. Apacha shook his head, though he understood the sentiment. "Not yet. Just rest. You need strength for when we reach safety." She closed her eyes, leaning against him, placing the last of her trust in his hands. The night seemed endless, each step a repetition of pain, focus, and vigilance. But as they neared the final stretch, the first signs of life appeared. The sound of water flowing from a nearby creek, the faint chatter of voices, the glow of lanterns reflecting off the canyon walls. Apache's heart lifted. Relief was so close he could almost touch it. Yet the desert had taught him that even the final steps could hold peril. Halfway up the plateau, a loose stone betrayed him. He stumbled slightly, and instinctively, the woman's hands gripped his shoulders not to support herself, but to anchor him. A small shared laugh escaped them both, weak and breathless, but it was a release, a reminder that despite the pain, they were still alive, still moving forward together. That fleeting moment of levity carried a deeper truth. They had endured, and they were stronger for it. As they reached the top of the plateau, Apache paused, allowing her to catch her breath. He looked at the settlement below, then back at her. Her eyes, wide with exhaustion and awe, met his. For a moment, words failed both of them. They had shared fear, pain, vulnerability, and endurance, and in the silence, an unspoken understanding formed. The journey had been more than physical. It had been a test of trust, resilience, and connection. Finally, Apache rose, taking the last steps down toward the edge of the village. The night wind tugged at his hair and clothes, and the woman leaned fully into him, relying on him entirely. Each step was careful, deliberate, a testament to their combined will. The glowing lights of the village seemed to pull them forward, offering hope, warmth, and a chance to rest. When they finally reached the edge of the settlement, Apache lowered her gently, letting her feet touch solid ground. Relief flooded him, mingled with exhaustion and an unexpected pride. She looked up at him, voice hoarse but full of gratitude. "We made it." He nodded, brushing dust from her hair. "Yes, and now you're safe." Yet beneath the relief, he sensed that the desert was only part of their journey. The physical struggle had ended, but challenges still awaited. The tribal politics, the unknown people in the settlement, and a secret that had yet to be revealed. For now, though, they allowed themselves a moment of reprieve. The final stretch had been endured, the bond between them solidified, and the first taste of safety offered them a fragile but vital sense of hope. Apache knew that what awaited them next could be just as dangerous, but he also knew that together they could face it. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling gold and amber across the desert settlement. Apache's steps were heavy, muscles screaming from the hours of relentless journeying, but the sight of the village gave him renewed strength. The woman in his arms stirred slightly, her head resting against his chest. She had survived the desert's brutal trials. Yet both of them knew that the final challenge awaited inside the village walls. They approached cautiously, aware that strangers and allies alike could pose unforeseen dangers. Apacha carried her with the same careful vigilance he had maintained for the entire journey, aware that one misstep or misjudgment could undo the trust they had built. As they entered the tribal enclosure, the activity of the village became apparent. People moving between tents, smoke rising from early fires, and children playing cautiously near the edges of the central clearing. Apache's eyes scanned each movement, each shadow, ensuring no threat emerged. At the center of the settlement, the chief's tent rose larger and more imposing than the others. Apache's jaw tightened as he approached. He could sense that the final step of their journey, the one that could shift the course of everything, was near. The woman stirred in his arms, her gaze meeting his. "Are they going to help us?" she whispered, exhaustion lacing every syllable. Apache simply nodded. "We'll find out soon enough. Trust me." Inside the chief's tent, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. The chief, a tall, imposing figure with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, regarded them silently. Apache lowered the woman carefully to the ground, ensuring she did not stumble, and stepped back. The chief's gaze shifted between them, studying their fatigue, their bond, and perhaps most importantly, the urgency etched into Apache's every movement. Then, with deliberate calm, the chief spoke. "You have brought her far and kept her alive," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "That is no small feat, but there is something you do not yet know." Apache's eyes narrowed, sensing the weight behind the words. The woman, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, sat up slightly, her curiosity mingled with fear. The chief paused, letting the silence build, the tension pressing against them like the desert winds they had endured. Finally, he revealed the truth. The woman was not merely a vulnerable survivor. She was the daughter of a rival leader, someone whose very existence carried consequences for alliances, rivalries, and the fragile balance of power within and beyond the tribe. The revelation hit Apache like a physical blow, the implications cascading through his mind. The woman's eyes widened as well, her hand reaching unconsciously toward her chest, as if to anchor herself in reality. "The one you saved," the chief continued, "holds a key that many have sought. Her life, her choices, will shape the destiny of more than just this tribe." Apache's mind raced. Every decision he had made, the rescue, the grueling journey, the trust he had built now carried far greater significance. The burden of her safety had expanded beyond survival. It was now entwined with political intrigue, the potential for conflict, and the unknown designs of those who would stop at nothing to claim her. The woman, regaining some of her composure, looked at Apache. You knew none of this," she whispered. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "I only knew you needed help," he said simply, the weight of the desert journey still evident in his posture. "Everything else, we faced together." The chief studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. But know this. The secret you now carry changes everything. There will be those who will come for her, and for you as well." Apache's gaze hardened, a silent vow forming in his mind. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would protect her. Not for duty, not for reward, but because he had promised first to the woman, and then to himself that she would survive. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began to warm the settlement, signaling the start of a new day. Inside, Apacha and the woman sat in silence, understanding that their journey had reached a turning point. The desert had tested them, forged a bond of trust and resilience, and now the true challenge awaited. Together, they would face whatever came next. The morning sun bathed the village in a soft golden light, warming the desert stones and scattering the lingering chill of night. Apache stood beside the woman, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding that went beyond words. The trials of the desert, the relentless journey, the danger, and the revelation from the chief had forged a bond neither could ignore. They were no longer merely rescuer and rescued. They were allies, confidants, and something more fragile and profound, a partnership built on trust and endurance. The villagers, curious and cautious, watched them with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Whispers ran through the camp as people noted the woman's presence, her injuries, and the protective stance of Apacha. The chief, seated on a raised platform in the center of the village, called for silence. He addressed the assembly, his voice commanding yet measured. This woman has survived what few could endure. She has been brought to us by one who has proven his courage and loyalty. But know this, her life carries consequences, responsibilities, and a secret that affects all of us. The woman's eyes flicked to Apacha, and he offered a reassuring nod. They had faced death together in the desert, had endured exhaustion, hunger, and fear, and now faced the complexities of tribal politics and allegiances. The weight of her identity and the secret revealed by the chief loomed over them, but they had emerged stronger, ready to confront it. The chief's revelation had been jarring. The woman was the daughter of a rival leader, a figure whose life could alter alliances and spark conflict. Yet, in the hours spent traveling, surviving, and relying on each other, she and Apacha had discovered something neither had expected, a connection that transcended circumstance, a bond forged in trust and hardship. The chief continued, "It is now your choice how you will proceed, how you will protect her, and what role you will play in the destiny she carries." Apache's gaze swept over the assembly, then returned to the woman. He saw not just vulnerability, but courage, intelligence, and a resolve honed by survival. She had been through far more than most, yet she had endured. Together, they had proven resilience beyond measure. She spoke then, her voice steady though lined with emotion. "I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I cannot face it alone. I trust him, and I choose to face what comes with him by my side." Apache's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and relief. He had never been one to seek companionship, yet in the desert's trials, he had discovered that trust and loyalty could forge bonds stronger than solitude. The villagers, moved by their courage and the clarity of their commitment, began to accept the pair. Even the chief, whose stern gaze had dominated the tent, nodded in acknowledgement. The secret, once a source of tension, now became a shared responsibility, one that required careful navigation, wisdom, and unity. As the day progressed, Apacha and the woman walked side by side through the village. Every step was deliberate but unhurried, a statement that they had survived, endured, and would now navigate the complexities of the future together. They discussed plans for safety, strategies for managing the woman's newfound role, and ways to honor the alliances that her identity demanded. But amidst the strategy and pragmatism, there was also quiet understanding, laughter, and the subtle joy of companionship discovered under the harshest of circumstances. By evening, they stood atop a small rise overlooking the settlement, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. Apacha's hand brushed against hers, not as a gesture of duty, but as a silent affirmation of their bond. They had faced death, betrayal, and uncertainty together and emerged not only alive but transformed. The chief's words from the morning echoed in their minds. The secret changed everything. Yet Apacha and the woman understood that the trials of the past had prepared them for this moment. They would face the unknown together, their bond a shield stronger than any weapon. In the desert, they had discovered trust, courage, and resilience, and in each other, they had discovered the strength to confront whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in hues of fire and gold, Apacha and the woman stood together, ready to embrace the challenges of the future. Their journey had forged not only survival but a partnership that promised hope, loyalty, and the unspoken promise that no matter what trials awaited, they would face them side by side.